Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Andrew Haile. I'm a third-year law student here at BC, and I'm here to talk to you about why I'm the only white guy on my Dorchester street. Not long ago, my wife and I purchased this lovely house in the lovely neighborhood of Dorchester, which we love. Dorchester is Boston's largest neighborhood. It's sprawling, it's diverse, it's very vibrant, and it just so happens that the neighborhood where we live is almost entirely African American and Hispanic. Now, living there and moving there and buying a house there has made us reflect quite a lot on why this is. Why is Boston such a segregated city? We moved from southern Jamaica Plain, which, if many of you are familiar with Boston, happens to be a neighborhood that's predominantly white. And you can drive about 5 minutes across Franklin Park from southern Jamaica Plain, which is predominantly white, and you can hit Blue Hill Ave in Dorchester, and all of a sudden, it's almost entirely African American and Caribbean. So that's interesting. So I want to talk to you a little bit today, not as an academic, but as somebody who cares and loves the city of Boston and somebody who cares passionately about racial justice and racial equality as to what I've learned about why this is. At a glance, Boston is very diverse. There's sort of a rich tapestry of ethnicities, a sort of blend of different ethnicities living in various places. It's a very international city with lots of colleges and universities. And yet, the city, as I just mentioned, is starkly segregated. 90% of African Americans in Boston live in one of three neighborhoods. That's Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan. And again, the segregation is very striking. You can just go a couple blocks over the south end, for example, over to Dudley Square, and all of a sudden the neighborhood demographics have changed dramatically. And so why is this? It's a fascinating question. And it's a very complicated question, but I want to focus, I have only very little time, I want to focus on just one era in the city of Boston's history, that is the late 1960s, when these neighborhood demographics shifted dramatically. And there's a reason for that. First of all, Boston was subject, like many cities in the US, to national trends which were happening at the time. First one was the Great Migration. Many of you are familiar, so between 1915 and 1970, 6 million African Americans left the South. They were fleeing racial terrorism, they were fleeing the fear of being lynched and being bombed and being harassed, they were fleeing discrimination, and they were arriving in cities like New York and Chicago and Detroit and Boston. So you had a large influx of African Americans coming up from the South. You also had the Civil Rights Movement. I love this photo. This is Dr. King marching, not in Selma, not in Birmingham, but on Charles Street here in Boston to the Boston Common, from Roxbury to the Boston Common. This is 1965, where he gave a speech on the Boston Common highlighting some of the civil rights issues that were right here in the North and right here in our city of Boston. And so at this time, the civil rights movement is happening, and there's a lot of changes happening nationwide. African Americans are experiencing some greater freedom of mobility. And so you have these national trends which were happening nationwide, but also happening here in Boston. On top of that, you have things that are unique to Boston. The cities of Roxbury, Dorchester, or the neighborhoods of Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan happen to be predominantly Jewish. In the 1950s, these neighborhoods had the largest community of Jews in New England. 70,000 Jews lived in Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, and you can see some of these symbols. This headline was from the Times of Israel article from November 2014 asking what happened to the Jews of Boston's Jew Hill Ave, which Blue Hill Ave, which of course is the large street that goes down, right down through Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, was known colloquially at the time. And so you had major synagogues. This is the Blue Hill Avenue Synagogue. This is the Mishkan Tefillah Synagogue on Seaver Street in Roxbury. That's the G&G Delicatessen on Blue Hill Ave, where if you were anybody that was interested in garnering the Jewish vote as a politician, you needed to go to the G&G to have a sandwich and try and get the vote. These were some major civic institutions at the time. So this is the lead up to the 1960s. Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan were predominantly Jewish. And yet you have this influx of African Americans coming up from the South. And so the city leaders got together and they established this thing called BBURG, the Boston Banks Urban Renewal Group. And this was a group of 22 banks who all got together to administer a mortgage fund for African Americans who were moving into the city. They had roughly over $40 million worth of federally backed loans to give to African American families. And so this group of bankers all got together and said, we are going to provide mortgages to African American families. And this was, in some ways, benevolent. This was kind of had good intentions of providing mortgages. And yet, they got together, and they had a meeting. This is in 1968. And the leader of this group of banks, Carl Erickson, took a red pen. And he had a map of Boston on the wall. And there was this meeting of sort of prominent vice presidents of these various banks. And they got together, and they had this map on the wall, and they took this red pen, and they drew a red pen around these certain neighborhoods in Boston. You can guess which neighborhoods those were. Roxbury, Dorchester, and parts of Mattapan, the neighborhoods that had been, and that were at the time, predominantly Jewish. And they said, well, we're going to establish this mortgage program for African Americans, but we're only going to give mortgages to African Americans in these communities. And the question was asked, well, what happens if somebody applies for a mortgage that's a block or two outside the red line? They'd be denied. And so you can imagine what happened in the span of a few years. These neighborhoods just flipped completely demographically. Massive white flight, African American families moving in en masse. And largely because of this redlining. And so you can see today that the neighborhood demographics track almost exactly where that red line was drawn back in 1968 from those bankers. Now, redlining wasn't the only practice that caused the neighborhood change. In addition to that, there was a practice called block busting, which was a sort of more explicitly pernicious racist act. And mortgage lenders would come through these predominantly white Jewish neighborhoods, and they would flyer the houses and flyer the cars. And they would engage in scare tactics and say, the value of your house is dropping $1,000 every month. You've got to get out now, sell now for cash, before your house is worth nothing. And on top of that, they would say things like, they are coming, you have a 12-year-old daughter, what happens if she was raped? You'd have a mulatto grandchild. So you can imagine what happened. White families sell their houses for a song. These mortgage lenders then turn around and give subprime loans to these African American families that are moving in at sky-high interest rates, which are very difficult to pay off. The foreclosure rate skyrockets, you have poverty, et cetera. And what you have today is these same entrenched issues are still happening in our city today. So you can see the sign of the times. The Mishkan Tefillah Synagogue in Roxbury is now the United House of Prayer for All People. The building is still there. It's now a black Pentecostal church. And the Mishkan Tefillah Synagogue, the congregation that used that synagogue has not gone away. It's just moved to Newton, right over here on Hammond Pond Parkway, in which is now a thriving congregation. The Blue Hill Avenue Synagogue, again, which used to be this sort of hotbed of Jewish civic activity and Jewish worship, is now the First Haitian Baptist Church. Why does this matter, ladies and gentlemen? The takeaway is that policies matter. 1968, those bankers got together and drew a line on a map, and somehow that matters today. That matters because these neighborhoods are still predominantly tracking the same demographics that all moved in 1968. These policies are why the white Jewish family that owned our house in the 1960s felt like they had to sell their house. Why the African American family that owned our house was so limited geographically to where they could come in and live. And these policies are why I'm the only white guy on my Dorchester street today. So the question I have for all of us is, what policies are being debated today that may have the same dramatic influence on our future? And what are we doing to impact them? Thank you.
Having wrestled